So good evening, everyone. Can somebody at home confirm that they can hear? You're not? Anybody? Yes, excellent. Felix has confirmed. So welcome to tonight's lecture, the Sir Seymour Biscoe Tritton lecture. We are honoured to have Bill Reeve as our presenter tonight, but a few localised safety instructions first. So there is no fire alarm scheduled for this time of the evening. I would imagine it doesn't say here, but if there is a fire alarm, please, upon hearing the fire alarm, which is a continuous bell, make your way to the illuminated fire exits. Without delay, leave the building by the main front doors, turn left along the pavement without crossing the road, pass beyond the end of the building and wait on the wide pavement for further instructions. Fire stewards will be on hand to manage the evacuation. Do not re-enter the building until the senior fire steward or fire service give permission. There are no fire drills due to take place. Therefore, should the alarm sound, please evacuate. So, it gives me a huge amount of pleasure to introduce Bill Reeve. Bill is Director of Rail at Transport Scotland, the transport agency of the Scottish Government. He is responsible for the specification and funding of Scotland's railway, including the ScotRail, the Caledonian Sleeper, rail freight policy, and Network Rail in Scotland. Bill's career in British Rail, the private rail industry, and now the Scottish Government has encompassed rolling stock engineering, freight and passenger business, strategy and investment, and now government policy and delivery. Bill is a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers and a past chair of its railway division. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say tonight.
Thank you very much.
One final admin for people that are remote. Please type your questions for Bill into the chat, and I will make sure that they're asked if we have sufficient time at the end of the session. For those in the room, at the relevant time, raise your hand. Thank you.
Cheers, Bill. Ready to go? Well, very good. Well, people of England, good evening. And for those of you online, wherever you are, a warm welcome too. This is a bit of a new experience for me. Normally I'm used to speaking in the main lecture hall, but this is the hybrid arrangement we have now. Normally we have Ward Geordian or Bobby Stevenson, the pictures of our forebears looking down on us, and I always wonder what they'd think of what we're about to say. But luckily they're not watching tonight, so I might be able to get away with anything. So anyway, here we go. So I've been asked to say a little bit about the Railways of Scotland and the approach we take to their strategic development, and I'll be happy to do so. Just perhaps worth remembering, after whom this lecture is named. There's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? The Sir Seymour Biscoe Tritton. They don't make names like that anymore, do they? But so as it happens, he was a past president of the Institution of Locomotive Engineers, which is what is now the railway division of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. So he's one of our forebears as the president, and you now will inherit his mantle as the chair of the railway division. I was intrigued to discover he worked a lot with government, both in India and in the United Kingdom, and he was a strong advocate of standardization in pursuit of efficiency. I really rather like this gentleman, so it's an honour. It's an honour to stand near where he has stood. So, for those of you who don't know, well, perhaps just a little bit about myself first. I'm often asked, perhaps given the way I speak, who I am and where I'm from and what on earth I'm doing in Scotland. So to clarify, I am a member of the United Kingdom Senior Civil Service, working for the Scottish National Party government of the Scottish Parliament. I'm an Englishman of half Irish extraction who was born in Cornwall. I live in Scotland in a town with a Welsh name in the county of West Lothian of the eponymous question, and I hope that clarifies matters for anyone that didn't know. So, what is my job? Well, I work as the rail director at Transport Scotland. I'll say a bit more about that in future, but what is Transport Scotland, for those of you who don't know? This is what it says if you look it up. It's really dull, isn't it? This is what it actually means. Crudely, if it moves in Scotland one way or another, we seem to fund it. or at least part of it. We are also the highways agency for Scotland, so the trunk roads of Scotland belong to Transport Scotland. So, and that makes for some really interesting discussions about transport as a system, rather than just narrowly individual elements of the transport system. And that informs the approach we take to railways. Why do we exist? Well, we exist actually in no small measure as a result of the devolution of rail responsibilities to the Scottish Parliament in 2005. And that triggered the creation of the Transport Agency in Scotland to take on those new rail strategies alongside the other rail policy and delivery, other transport policy and delivery objectives. And what was devolved? Well, what was devolved, importantly for this evening, was the responsibility to make strategies for the railways of Scotland. We are also the franchising authority under current legislation for ScotRail and the Caledonian Sleeper. Very importantly, we have our own Scottish Government high-level output specification for Network Rail in Scotland. And we provide the funding for Network Rail in Scotland, or at least very nearly 95% of it. So who's counting the difference? Well, we do. Right, so for those not familiar with Scotland, this is it, or this is a picture of it, excluding, I'm embarrassed to note, the Shetland Isles, must do something about that, and the Orkneys. It's a substantial railway network in its own right. It's about 11% of the GB rail network, and we're working on making that a higher percentage year by year. Likewise, I have to keep updating these slides with the latest stations that we've opened, the last one being in May this year. We were approaching 100 million passengers, and strong growth over a number of years since devolution pre-COVID. We are currently around 70% of pre-passenger numbers, but the rail freight sector has boomed again. I'll speak more of that again later. It's a chunky system. So if I am to talk about the strategy, I like to use the mnemonic of an ABC of the Scottish Railway strategy. And we'll start in this ABC with A being for alignment. It's a dull sort of sounding word, isn't it? But what does it mean? Well, firstly, of the railway with government. That's my job, really, actually. I am responsible for managing the politics railway interface. And it's often the case that people on either side don't necessarily understand as much about the other as either would wish that they did. And I see my colleagues from the English government, sorry, the United Kingdom government nodding, and that's a common experience of a civil servant. I should perhaps have said, I'm a bit of an accidental senior civil servant. I actually started on the railway industry in crew locomotive works, but I followed the work under privatisation into government, where it turns out that the decisions that used to be taken in the railway before privatisation are now taken by government afterwards, which is a bit odd, really, but there it is. So, really important that we align the money we spend. We spend £1.5 billion a year on the railways of Scotland, which is a lot of money, a substantial proportion of the Scottish Government budget, actually. Why do we spend that money? We do it to support this purpose, as we spend all of the money we spend on transport, creating a more successful country that gives opportunities to all people living throughout Scotland to improve their well-being, to create sustainable and inclusive growth, and to reduce inequalities, as well as supporting environmental and social progress. That's it. You can read about the National Performance Framework, but that's why we spend the money on the railways as we do on anything else in Scotland. Underneath that, we have a published National Transport Strategy. In fact, this is the second of our National Transport Strategies. Apologies if you can't read the small writing at the back, but we think that's really important. This transport strategy links to that purpose. That's why you'll see it focuses on reducing inequalities, taking climate action, delivering inclusive economic growth, and improving health and well-being. And transport has an important role to play in all of those strategic objectives. Importantly, that strategy makes clear this hierarchy. Some might call it the inverted hierarchy. We want to encourage, above all else, walking and wheeling, then cycling, so that's active travel for us, then public transport, then taxis and shared transport, and only after that, the private car. And we need to have that change of focus in order to deliver the outcomes, those strategic outcomes on the left. We link that strategy to our capital investment plan. Currently in consultation, there is the strategic, I think consultation is just closed, the strategic transport project review, again, the second one we have done since Transport Scotland was created, which sets out looking at investment priorities across all of Scotland with reference to those strategic priorities, the priorities for investment of future capital expenditure in transport. So that's where we weigh up the relative merits of road schemes and rail schemes and active travel schemes and bus provision and light rail. That's all done within this framework. I should have said I've got far too much to tell you this evening, by the way. But it's okay because the sleeper back to Scotland doesn't need till 10 to midnight, so I think there should be time. So press on. I dare say the chairman will keep me right if I don't. And we do publish strategies, just specifically about rail. We published a number of years ago our rail freight strategy, but we did not leave it on the shelf. We have taken that strategy. We have worked with our colleagues in the logistics industry and the rail freight industry in order to make it real. Likewise, 2 years ago now, we published our rail decarbonisation action plan. This is not a recommendation from the railway industry to government. This is an instruction from government to the railway industry to get on with it. So, some of you, this is a bit naughty, this slide, but I couldn't resist it. So some of you will know that Monty Python and the Holy Grail was filmed in Scotland, so this image just seems somehow appropriate. When my colleagues south of the border say, would you like to join us on our quest for the Holy Grail of the whole industry strategic plan? I tend to reply, but without the cod French accent, no thanks, we already have one. And it is very nice. But actually, really pleased to have the opportunity to work with our colleagues in the GBR transition team and in Friends in the Department of Transport, because some of what we have done are things that others can learn from, and we have a huge interest in the railway south of the border being successful as well. So we are very pleased to work in partnership, but I couldn't quite resist that slide. So A is for alignment of the railway with government, but critically, it is about alignment between railway delivery partners. And I think it's fair to say the root cause of most of the difficulties we have had in delivering our strategies and most of the sources of inefficiencies and most of the causes of delay in what ought to be straightforward things, the root cause of that is a lack of alignment in the incentives between rail industry partners. That can lead to frustration and to cost and to delay. So perhaps it's just worth reflecting. Rail reform has been all the rage, hasn't it? So here are my two reflections on, I've lost track of the number of rail reform processes. My learned colleague from the DFT at the back may be able to keep me right here, but I've lost track of how many rail reform processes since privatisation there have been, but this is my observation of all of them. First is, with apologies to Jane Austen, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a railway system in possession of a substantial deficit must be in want of a guiding mind. The second rule is less well known, but actually fundamentally perhaps more important. It is a truth rarely acknowledged, but actually more universally held, that no one is content for anybody else to be the guiding mind. I suppose you could summarize as never underestimate the forces of reaction. And again, I can think of colleagues who might have some reflections about that. Why does it matter? Well, here you are. Here's a simple diagram illustrating the key money flows of the Scottish railway industry. I hope that's clear. And if it is clear, I hope someone will explain it to me. Because it is hideously complicated. This is the rail industry structure we have to work within. There may be some people who think this is a good idea. Counselling is available. But this is the system we have to work within. The one thing I can tell you is that nearly everything that doesn't come from either the passenger or the freight customer gets paid for by government. Nearly everything. And in the case of a railway network with economic characteristics of Scotland, very similar to other parts of Britain, the north of England, Wales, and other parts of Britain as well, that's a very substantial proportion of the turnover has to be funded by government. So somebody has to actually take an overview of that and bring this together. Because when you look at where the big money goes, and by the way, last full year, the turnover of the Scottish Railway Industry was about £1.85 billion. When you look at where it goes, the green bits crudely are on the infrastructure, so rather more than half if you include our enhancement expenditure, which varies a bit from year to year according to our programmes, and slightly less than half is from train operating costs. Now that will vary from region to region. This is how it works out in Scotland. But actually, if you start taking decisions about renewals without understanding what your priorities are for your rolling stock, or vice versa, if you start developing timetables that trigger costs in one bit of the system without balancing revenue somewhere else, you can get yourself into a right old pickle. A lot of our processes actually in the rail industry focus only on one half or the other. Rarely does that produce an efficient answer. So in Scotland, we try always to remember that critical relationship between the timetable, which is the half the product that we're offering to the freight customers and passengers, the infrastructure and the rolling stock, and we trade off the relationship between those three in optimizing the specification for the current railway and the railway of the future. And we have between us a rail enhancements and capital investment strategy. We value a pipeline approach, and we have a focus on whole life costs of the whole railway system, not just the infrastructure or the train operating company or the freight operating company, but the whole railway system. We think even when we get that right, that does help confidence in the supply chain. And we don't actually anymore know how to, nor would we want to, nor would we ever think why you would go about changing a railway system without thinking about it as a whole. So here is a phrase you'll hear me use a lot, and you'll hear my colleagues in Scotland use a lot, which is Team Scotland. And this really matters. So we put a lot of effort, management time and focus, and all of the regulatory and contractual levers at our disposal into getting that alignment between rail industry partners. So when we write our high-level output specification, our specification for the ScotRail franchise has exactly the same targets in it. There is one ppm target for Scotland's railway, 92.5%. I think it's the case that isn't the case elsewhere, which I find a bit puzzling. We have a ScotRail alliance, formally contracted between ScotRail Trains and Network Rail. We have not part of the formal governance, but we have a really important working group called the Rail Business Integration Group, where the senior management teams of ScotRail, Network Rail, Transport Scotland, Caledonian Sleeper, and when appropriate, our colleagues in the freight sector as well, are invited to participate in discussion papers, planning papers. We work our authorities for capital investment within Team Scotland Execution Plan, which is shared with our colleagues in our delivery organisations. The Rail Decarbonisation Action Plan came out of joint working groups with our colleagues. And we are currently working on a whole system signalling strategy because Lord knows we need one. And that is being done in partnership with the train operating companies and with Network Rail and ourselves, because we take better decisions quicker when we take them together. That is our consistent experience in Scotland. That whole system perspective gets you to a better answer sooner. And here is just one illustration of that. By the way, these numbers won't be right, but the very fact we have them at all is a tribute to the sort of work that our joint working produces. This is a net cost analysis of one of our trunk routes in Scotland. And this shows ScotRail revenue, ancillary revenues, don't have access to the revenue of other train operating companies and freight companies, but we have an estimate. We've included the track access charges that come from them in terms of money towards maintaining the network. We have what we think is a fair allocation of the costs for that bit of the network for the infrastructure, as well as the operating costs for ScotRail. And we have, against a passenger revenue, well, total revenue of 67 million, we have total costs of 195 million and total net cost of 127 million. Net cost is code for government expenditure. What's interesting and encouraging is that was produced by my colleagues and offered to us as an analysis for our shared understanding, because actually that's triggered a lot of our thoughts about how to invest in this route in order to drive down cost and to drive up revenue. And there's a substantial opportunity to do both of those things. And I may return to that case a little later, if the chairman allows me. B is for building on success. Actually, I started by thinking what I'll do is I'll put a few pictures up of the different projects we've delivered since devolution, but I couldn't get them all on one slide, and I've probably forgotten some of these. So these were the ones I could remember on the way here. But actually, the point is you keep investing in the railway because you've got a strategy, you know where you're trying to get to. As the opportunities arise or the need arises, as assets wear out, it does inform your next investment decisions. So we are pleased with that track record, which of course didn't include this other quite important bit of our track record, which is our rolling programme of electrification. And the fact we do have a rolling programme. There's electrification underway between Glasgow and Barrhead and East Kilbride, and about to start to Fife, and indeed on the borders. And that's really important if you want to build the expertise in your delivery partners as part of Team Scotland, including our suppliers to our delivery partners, because there's an awful lot of money to be wasted relearning the same mistakes every time when you stop and start and stop and start. So this is where we've got to since 2005. We now have 5 electrified routes between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Who knew you needed that many? But the point is, it's actually about connecting the communities between Edinburgh and Glasgow with Edinburgh and Glasgow. That's about connecting communities with opportunities for employment, for education, for leisure, for shopping, for meeting families, for healthcare. This provides carbon-free, sustainable connectivity for the communities of Scotland. 76% of Scottish Rail passenger journeys now are undertaken by electric train. Regrettably, only 45% of freight journeys, even though we always, as a matter of policy, electrify freight terminals as part of our passenger electrification projects while we are passing. The problem is the other end of the route isn't electrified. So I just wanted to explain how we're doing for time.
About halfway through, just over halfway.
Very good. Right, I think I'll just get away with this. Okay, so why do we spend this money? Why it is just worth reflecting. Why do we spend this money? Here's a picture of a train on the Borders Railway. The clever amongst you will notice there are no wires over that yet. Please note the yet. So here we are. There's the good Dr. Beeching with his report. That was the Waverley route from Edinburgh to Carlisle. There were the protesters at number 10. Instantly, the lady in the middle of the middle picture was, I'm delighted to say, our guest on the very first train at the opening of the Borders Railway. So pleased to have Madge Elliott with us on that occasion, because this really mattered to the communities when they lost their rail connectivity. Why did it matter? Sorry if you can't quite read the numbers, but the little red line, dotted lines are the time it would take you to get by public transport from the Borders towards Edinburgh. So 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and you still hadn't got to Edinburgh by public transport before we built the railway. That's too long a distance for the community to be connected by public transport in any effective economic and social means. And this is why we invest in railways. We are investing in the economy and in social inclusion. This is an analysis by the districts of Scotland, by region of Scotland, of gross value added per capita, basically how much wealth per person in each of the regions. And you'll see that Edinburgh was at the top of the list, and Scottish Borders was third from the bottom. And by the way, the railway runs through East Lothian and Mid Lothian, certainly through Mid Lothian, sorry, and that was second from the bottom. So this is about connecting underperforming bits of our economy with parts of the economy that are working really well. If you get it right, you have a great party. The late Queen honoured us with a visit. I understand that for 2 days, the Twitter feed on the opening of the Borders Railway was the highest followed Twitter feed in the world. It coincided with the date when the Queen became the longest reigning monarch in Britain. But this is really the benefits realisation. It wasn't just the party, though that was good, I have to say. This was just within the first year, 36% new journeys to and from the borders. 57% of those were converted from car. 39% increase in tourism, fastest increase in tourism of any district of Scotland as a result of the opening of this railway. Rail cited as a factor in 50% of house moves into the borders and 80% of job moves. And since then, there's been substantial investment by companies in the borders, locating production and headquarters operations, citing the railway as the reason they chose the borders for their location. And a 24% increase in overnight stays, which links to the tourism. That's why we build railways. By the way, before I go on to the next point, that's exactly what we're doing with Leavenmouth at the minute. We're reopening short 5-mile line to Leavenmouth, never formally closed, but I wouldn't like to try and get a train along it. Why are we doing that? Well, it's really interesting when you look at the social figures for the community of Leavenmouth and Methil and in that area. Stats that come to mind, things like a far lower percentage of children coming out of school in the Leavenmouth area were going on to college than elsewhere in Scotland. Why was that? Was it because they weren't bright enough? Certainly not. It was because they couldn't actually get to and from the colleges in Edinburgh and Dunfermline, because the public transport wasn't giving them a viable proposition to make that journey possible. That's just one of the things that reopening that railway will do. And we've taken the opportunity, back to alignment, to commission a parallel and linked project of active travel pathways to and from the new stations. We're looking at how we refocus the bus network as we did in the borders. This is an opportunity to transform the economic connectivity and the social welfare of the communities that transport investment will serve. It happens to be a railway. That's not why we're doing it. So, C is for a competitive railway. What does that mean? Well, firstly, competitive railways are about attractive services. We need to attract people out of their cars, and indeed we need to attract freight out of the lorries and onto the railway. We cannot in Scotland depend upon the fact that the roads are too congested to make road commuting viable. And indeed, of growing importance is leisure traffic as a percentage of the total post-COVID anyway. And you only get people choosing to spend their hard-earned money if you're providing something that they actually want. So I'm a bit of a history buff when it comes to railways. I was impressed by the Midland Railway, which in 1875 did something astonishing. It took all of its third-class carriages, which were just hard wooden seats, out of service. It declassified its second-class carriages, which had cushions, and it gave them to the labouring classes to travel with. And the other railways thought they were mad, except it turned out people liked travelling on more comfortable trains, and therefore more of them did it. And all of the other railways had to follow. Turns out, if you provide comfortable and attractive services, people are more inclined to use them and pay for them. I was looking, interestingly, at some acceleration stats from different types of rolling stock only recently, exploring how you might use service trains to monitor infrastructure, another bit of joining things up. But what struck me really was a 158 had far lower accelerations for the passenger than a 170. And luckily I was unable to see the Azuma stats because I wonder what those would have been. Is there anyone in this august company that feels that we have got trains as comfortable as passengers would like to have at the moment? Anyone online? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So we are running high-speed trains on our in-city routes, not because these are a long-run solution, but they do provide comfortable seats, which it turns out passengers really like. We have taken a 153 and we have, for use on our scenic routes, we have put in a huge amount of cycle provision because actually Fort William is a mountain biking capital of the world, from what I can make out. And we want to encourage that sort of tourism, and we want to provide appropriate facilities rather than being told, I wanted to take my bike to Fort William, but there was no space. Or I couldn't even work out how to get the booking. The same is absolutely true for freight. We need to provide, my colleagues in Network Rail need to provide attractive paths for freight operators. We will move, as the franchising authority, the times of passenger trains in order to provide more competitive journey times and resource utilisation for freight operators. There's the First Minister this August at the opening of the Blackford terminal for Highland Springs. So mineral water will now move by rail rather than by HGV. My road maintenance colleagues on the A9 love this project. They just think that's great. So do the people who live in Blackford, by the way, because it's reducing the number of heavy goods vehicles running through their town. And Highland Spring gets a competitive advantage because it's actually cheaper to move bulk product by rail than it is by road. So the economy is benefiting, the community is benefiting, the environment's benefiting, and it was also another jolly good party. But this is exactly why we have to focus on what freight customers and passengers want, and look at the levers we have available to make this work. I have to pay tribute to my colleagues in Network Rail. One of the things we did in Scotland was create a rail freight growth target for Network Rail. We included it in our HLOS, and they have responded magnificently. I was astonished the pace with which they got that new rail freight connection in, faster than I'd ever seen before and for a lower cost than I ever dared hope for. It is interesting when you get everyone pointed in the right direction, what amazing things can be achieved. And it hardly needs saying, except that it does. A competitive railway is efficiently delivered. And you cannot afford to deliver attractive services if you do not have a constant focus on spending your money on only that which is necessary, and spending that on that which is necessary as efficiently as possible. We spend a lot of our time in Team Scotland identifying the next step we can take on the efficiency journey for critical investments like electrification costs. And that's also why we are working together on the signalling strategy, because the unit cost of signalling has gone entirely the wrong way in recent years, and we see a route to a more efficient future. These key building blocks of the railway cost structure are vital if we are to deliver our mission for the society of Scotland in alignment with the Scottish Government's purpose. Of course, I'm going to cheat now because it's not just about the ABC, is it? It's about D for decarbonisation, because that does rather matter. Fine, yeah, I think I'm still getting away with it. 37% of emissions in Scotland come from transport, or thereabouts. That has remained stubbornly high. The power sector has transformed its emissions in Scotland. There are no coal-fired power stations in Scotland anymore. We are blessed with a lot of wind and water, so we are able to generate a lot of electricity, actually a surplus of electricity in a green manner, but transport has remained stubbornly a really high part of the emission mix. But the good news is rail is on the side of the angels. We are only 1.2% of that 37%, even with a still fair proportion of diesel services on some of our routes. So the best thing we can do to decarbonise Scotland from a transport perspective is to get more of that 25% of emissions coming from heavy and light goods vehicles and the 40% coming from cars out of the cars, lorries and vans, and onto the environmentally friendly rail system. And indeed, we commissioned as Transport Scotland, did a work by a firm called Element Energy, looking at what it takes for us to hit our legal targets. They make the not unimportant point that if you want to hit a target in some years' time that's really quite demanding, you better get on with it. So we have to keep going. I'm under pressure here, so I shall carry on. Crudely, that requires rail to convey about 57% more folk than it does now under one viable scenario. We have plans for all of our modes, but I'm talking tonight about rail, because actually it's hard to decarbonise some of the roads. This is a bit of fun with the chairman's, which I can't actually get to work. How are we going to decarbonise is the question. We explore all options. This is a carbon-free train. Hope you can hear me. This is a gravity train on the Fastidiog Railway. Its ride comfort compares favourably with some sort of rolling stock I've been on. But it only goes downhill. Now that's all right. We all know it's downhill from Scotland to England, but we do want people to visit as well. So this may not be the right technology for us, but never pass up an opportunity to learn. And of course, we are therefore supporting, and this was at COP26 last year, just over a year ago, we're supporting projects that are exploring the practicalities and economics of alternative traction as a fuel cell train. We have supported within Scotland, and I see some folk in the audience involved in that project, we have supported the conversion of an old ScotRail unit to fuel cell traction. That's not because we want to run this in passenger service, but it actually has taught the supply sector within Scotland a huge amount about how to integrate fuel cell technology with rail traction requirements. And there are lots of available solutions now. I do like that, the less CO2 by rail. Even a diesel train is hugely environmentally advantaged over the equivalent number of HGVs on the A9 that would have required. But we know what better looks like, don't we? There are other technologies available. Some of us on the IMechE Railway Division trip this year saw battery locomotives, steel works in South Wales, very impressive technology, but for a particular purpose. So we, our ministers, published our Decarbonisation Action Plan in 2021. And it started back to that joined-up view. It recognises that we have an ageing fleet in ScotRail. We have some very new and bright and shiny fleets, but we have some old trains, both diesel and electric, that are going to need replacing. Particularly for the diesels, the question is, with what should we replace them? This, I think, is a not unimportant table to help answer that question. Now, this is a bit of analysis we continue to refine, but this would be our current estimate of the operating cost per vehicle mile of the different technologies. Diesel at £1.94 per vehicle mile. You'll see that battery electric is cheaper than that. Electric is very much cheaper than that, and hydrogen is inconveniently more expensive than diesel to operate. Here again is a bit of the joint analysis that came out of this, a preliminary analysis, numbers still to be validated, but actually it feels it's about right. This is that train trunk route we looked at earlier. This is about, if you just apply the passenger demand forecasting handbook, try and get that right, you get small, what's called Sparks effect uplift in revenue. Of course, if we electrify this railway, we will get an increase in infrastructure maintenance costs. That's that red blocks in the middle. But you get a huge saving in fuel costs. You get a huge saving in rolling stock maintenance costs. You get a huge saving in rolling stock ownership costs. And the net result is a very substantial improvement in the net profitability of that particular trunk route. And that doesn't take account of the superior performance of electric trains, which will allow us to run more trains, both passenger and freight, faster on the same railway without needing to put as much money into extra infrastructure to accommodate them. So this is just a table which highlights the power to weight ratio of electric trains versus diesel trains. I will be disappointed if anyone in this room does not know that electric trains tend to accelerate faster than diesels. And you can buy bimodes, you can, and they're jolly useful for all sorts of reasons. But typically, if you don't combine the sort of hybrid mode of battery and diesel of this magnificent little beastie, that's getting me at about 1,700 horsepower in old money, which is almost only about a third of what this beastie will do in electric traction. If I want to run a mixed traffic railway, and I do, where freight trains have good, fast, economical paths, I need them to be being pulled by 5,400 horsepower, not 1,700 horsepower. So actually, in Scotland, D for decarbonisation is spelt with an E for electrification. And that's what our Decarbonisation Action Plan says. And these are the routes we are planning to electrify. And those are the ones we're planning to electrify after that. And we think that would be a really good way of having an affordable railway in future, as well as a sustainable and environmentally friendly railway. We're not just talking about it, we are getting on with it. As I think I mentioned earlier, here is a map of the central belt of Scotland for those not familiar with it. The black bits on there are committed electrification schemes, actually mostly, at least as far as Barhead, and then got to Kilmarnock yet. And I couldn't resist it, F is for freight. Why? Back to the whole picture again. Does anyone know an economical replacement for a diesel engine and heavy goods vehicle, a 44-ton heavy goods vehicle, such as delivers most of the things you have in your home, one way or another, at least for part of the journey? Because I don't. There are various options. You could try battery. That kind of limits you on range and there's a big weight penalty. The vehicles in the middle there are fuel cell vehicles deployed in Glasgow, a bus and a refuse lorry. But again, shorter distances, quite high cost. It's a trolley bus. I know there's some talk about trunk road electrification. There are some trials. My understanding from those involved with them is it's quite difficult, to put it mildly. But there are solutions that allow us to have lower operating costs, lower emissions for trunk haul of freight. That's the Varamis Express, which started operating recently between Birmingham International and Glasgow for the movement of parcels. At the bottom there we have, and it was a couple of years ago, a new freight flow to Elderslie in Scotland, operated by GB Rail Freight, I think. But look at that picture. That's a diesel running underneath wires. Why? Because actually, unfortunately, upon sections of that route, the power supply is not yet powerful enough to accommodate electric haulage of freight trains, which is a bit of a shame if you wanted to be able to run more freight trains or indeed even more passenger trains, because the last thing you want on a busy trunk route is a slow freight train. Fast freight trains, very different thing. So actually, one of the reasons we're committed to full electrification is we need the performance on trunk routes for freight that electrification gives us. Really, penultimate slide. I just had to do this last one. Does anyone know, for all of that, what my favourite train in Scotland is? Scottish delegates here present are not allowed to answer that. Sorry? Oh, that's a nice. No, it's a good one, but no. No, it is this. Why is this my favourite train in Scotland? Again, the whole system perspective. It is the only timetabled passenger train in Scotland to operate wholly in Scotland that I don't have to subsidise. People come from around the world to travel on that. It triggers great demand in the hotel trade in Fort William. There is a restaurant trade in Mallaig that depends utterly upon that, and there isn't a Visit Scotland brochure that doesn't have a picture of that train. That's, when you see the big picture, you understand that's not just a nice steam train, although it is, set in magnificent scenery, although it is. That is using the railway for the purpose of supporting the economy and society. And I think that's quite important. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Bill. There's a huge number of very challenging points that you put forward for the whole of the railway.
I was afraid you were going to say challenging questions. So.
and actually, I think there should be a great deal of questions that can be raised against it. So we'll ask those online to add to the chat room, or the chat, any questions you may have. But I'll start in the room. And I would like to invite James to ask the first question. We've got a microphone. Please use the microphone because it makes sure that people online can actually hear the question.
Thank you. Hello, James Collinson, in Media Past Chair of the Railway Division. So Bill, thank you very much for what was really quite an interesting and insightful story of your journey as a rail director in Team Scotland, I should say, not Transport Scotland. So one of the things that dawned on me was, how do you do it? And when I say that, I mean the alignment part. When you reflect on the reforms, the many reforms that you've seen and worked through, and this includes changes in leadership, so individuals can also make quite an impact on changing a journey's direction. what would you say has been the one thing, or your one thing or approach that has been your secret to successful alignment of strategies?
Ooh, one thing, gosh, never miss an opportunity to bring things together when you can. I don't necessarily mean structurally, but when we publish our strategies, they all point in one direction. When we publish our high-level output specification, it has the same targets as our policy spec for the passengers. When we look at our investments, we consider the freight and the passenger thing alongside. So don't miss the opportunities, but work at the team building. Think about what you can do with the right leaders to build that message, to reinforce alignment of the messages. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by accident. But I say to my team in Transport Scotland, your most important project, our most important project as Transport Scotland, is not to electrify another route or buy another fleet of trains or open another railway. Our most important project is to cause our delivery partners in Scotland's railway to understand what those priorities are, to want to deliver those themselves, to be aligned to the same definition of success. Because when we get our delivery partners aligned with our objectives, amazing things happen.
Thank you.
Other questions in the room? David. Sorry, just behind you.
Hello, David Clark from the Rail Industry Association. Thank you, Bill, for a fascinating presentation as ever. I was particularly taken by the P&L analysis that you did of a route, and then you considered the alternatives in a later slide. So I've got a load of questions, but if I stick to a couple. So I'm guessing that P&L was after COVID, and therefore there's the challenge of recovering from, I think you said 70% pre-COVID levels to 100% of pre-COVID levels.
Yep.
So my first question is, given all the things you've said about social inclusion and attractiveness of railways and so forth, how are we doing in recovering the missing 30%?
Okay.
And my second question, which is a slightly different one, is how can we as the supply chain, given the visibility, you just said it in your answer to James' question, how can we make sure that we're totally aligned, understanding our customers' business and understanding that P&L, so we can bring you between those two things, increasing revenue and us helping you on potentially on cost. We can bring P&L into a much better shape.
That's sneaky. That was at least two questions in there. But here we go, David. So look, passenger demand patterns have changed fundamentally. So interestingly, Saturday is now the busiest day of the week on the railways in Scotland. I think that's pretty much the case across Britain now. The Monday to Friday commuting peak doesn't really exist in the same way that it used to. Interestingly, there's a distinct build in demand over the course of a week. And Friday afternoons are busy in a way that Monday mornings are not, interestingly. So there's a whole interesting set of patterns within that. What is clear is that there is a growing demand for longer distance travel. Some of the train operators have had the highest return of passenger numbers are some of the longer distance operators who have perhaps a pent up demand for people to travel after the last couple of years. But there is a growth in demand. So that the railway has to understand the opportunity. When I looked at that profit and loss account for that railway, crude first order analysis though it is, talking with Team Scotland colleagues, we can see a way to turn that into a cash positive railway. We know what investments would drive down the operating cost, and we know what service patterns would improve the attractiveness, both for passengers and for freight. We think of both of those. And it's not implausible when I look at the current rail market share, for example, of the passenger market, to see a trebling of that on that particular corridor, which, by the way, our strategy says we need to do for transport decarbonisation. None of those things feels impossible. So actually, if you have that clear vision of where you might go, you stand a better chance of getting there. What can your suppliers do? I'm really pleased some of your colleagues and some of your members are coming to see us in Edinburgh soon. We have that discussion directly. That is great. I would invite some of them to stop trying to sell me new equipment that costs more to operate than the stuff it replaces and needs to be renewed sooner, because that's not a great investment proposition, frankly. I would ask them to work with my partners, my delivery partners, in identifying how we can drive down, in particular, for capital investment in infrastructure, the ratio of overheads to direct costs that is typical of a current GB infrastructure project on the railways, which I think remains inexcusably poor with reference to best practice, although better in Scotland than elsewhere.
In the absence of the in-room microphone for a moment, I'll ask a couple of the online questions. Oh, no, sorry, you do have it in your hand. Apologies, I didn't see it.
Hello, Phil Sharp from Modern Railways. As a journalist, I'm told there's never such a thing as a stupid question, so I'm going to.
That isn't true, by the way, Phil. That isn't true.
well, let's try this one first. With David mentioned it, we talked a lot about the mythical route. Which route are you talking about? And then I'll ask us.
So I'm not going to answer that, although those of you with some wit will realise there aren't that many options. But no, carry on.
Okay, right. And the second question is, you talked a lot about the rolling paper of electrification and how decarbonisation is spelled working with an E. How come Scotland has managed to make a persuasive case for a rolling program of electrification and we've not managed to do it south of the border? What are you doing right that we?
I think it would be for others to answer the investment priorities of the railway south of the border. That is not my job. But what's important for us, as well as choosing what we do invest in, actually you have to make choices. There are things we don't invest in. E is not, for example, for ETCS in Scotland at the moment. I refer you, David, to my earlier observation with respect to equipment that costs a lot of money, doesn't actually help very much, and needs to be replaced sooner. So we're quite clear about the priorities we have, because we have a strategic plan, because we know what we're trying to achieve. Can I look anyone in this room and say I'm absolutely confident that everything will roll out exactly as I conceive it might in our outline plan now? No, because budgets will change, the environment will change, events will happen. COVID came when we didn't expect it, whole lots of other things. But if you know where you're trying to get to, even if you have to tack a bit on the wind shifts, there's far more chance you're going to get there. So I think understand the priorities, focus on those, don't get distracted would probably be my recommendation.
Elaborating on that slightly, using taking on Mr. Shiraz's question from online.
The learned Mr. Shiraz, who I should have acknowledged his slide, by the way. So thank you, David.
And I apologise, David, for paraphrasing because we haven't got much time. What is it about the business case for electrification that makes it work in Scotland where we can't make it work in the rest of the UK?
Do you know what? It's hard to make it work. You have to be relentless about driving down the cost. And we're still not as far down that journey as we need to be. But my colleagues in Network Rail took themselves off to see some best-in-class electrification elsewhere in Europe and come back with a recognition of how they could change what they're doing. I really commend that approach. But look, I think the thing that makes me focused on this is there is no do nothing here. If we are serious about replacing diesel, given what we know about emissions, both in terms of climate change and importantly in health impact of diesel particulates, then we need to replace it with something. And if we do not invest now, while we have the chance to put the electron conducting strings up over the infrastructure, when the current trains either fall over because they're too old or actually are no longer legal to run, we will end up having to buy trains that cost more to buy and more to operate. We already have a financial challenge given that ratio of revenue to operating cost. So a future which is financially sustainable or more financially sustainable versus one that is less financially sustainable, that concentrates the mind a bit.
And that leads us nicely on to the second online question, which is from Neil Hutchinson, which is, when do we think that hydrogen freight trains will be introduced? That does make the assumption that they are, you do think they're going to be introduced.
I'm not aware of any immediate plans that are realistically likely to be delivered in that respect soon. I wouldn't rule it out in the limit, but I think there are other things we should be focused on first.
Third question online, and then I'll come back to the room. So go think about your questions in the room, please. From the esteemed Professor Felix Schmidt, how do you define a comfortable train?
Well, I'm inclined to use the Reeve Mark 1 posteriometer. And I find that it calibrates quite well with the experience of others, actually. I mean, that's a seriously important question, which does mean that one has to think about how one contracts for a comfortable train very carefully, because there's not I don't believe the posteriometer is enforceable in a civil contract. But you have to think about it, and you have to think about how you're going to cause it to be comfortable. And I could certainly give the learned Professor Schmidt a number of examples of trains which experience and other customer feedback suggests are not comfortable.
Further questions from the room? Well, to your right.
Hello there, Fraser Sterling from Enigma 7 Consulting. Bill, one thing you didn't touch on too much was just around revenue and revenue growth, and how that relates to things like ticket pricing and other levers you've got, such as road pricing, and how to pull those levers to get that modal shift. So I just wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how you see that progressing.
Well, that's a whole other lecture, frankly. Clearly, I mean, particularly in the context of the cost of living crisis, making sustainable transport affordable is not nice to have, it's must have, isn't it? And of course, there are issues around elasticity of demand. The more you put price up, the less people travel, or less people are prepared to buy. Although a lot of the models we use that people pretend are still accurate are calibrated to behaviours before COVID. So actually, if anyone tells you they know what demand will be in future, they're either a knave or a fool, or possibly both. Yeah, we do think carefully about fare structures. The Scottish Government will be publishing in the new year the first outputs of our fares fare review. So I commend that for your attention when it comes. Personally, I reflect that places that have the highest modal shift very often have better integration between modes, which makes the choice not to use a private car easier. And of course, one watches with a great deal of interest things like the Austrian climate ticket and other examples around Europe. I know at least one person in this room who benefited from reduced fare in France to the beach recently, designed to encourage people to take the train and not the car with their buckets and spades. So these things bear a lot of consideration, but I don't think I have time to answer that question fully just now.
I think I'm going to go against all normal protocols and take advantage of my position as chair.
I'm not entirely surprised by that. No, I'm not wholly surprised by that.
I apologise to those.
But I approve of the chair's prerogative.
I apologise to those online whose questions we haven't been able to ask. But you gave a somewhat humorous and slightly cynical view of the guiding mind, in your view, the rules of reform. I would see Transport Scotland as the epitome of a guiding mind. Would you not? And if not, what would you see it as being?
Crikey. So my views on rail reform just reflected my experience of rail reform, and there have been quite a few goes at it. And so I was trying to think of a way of conveying that. That is back to that point about we can wait till the magnificent rail reform comes along. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't. Actually, in the meantime, the truth is there's an awful lot you can do without rail reform if you set about establishing the right relationships with your delivery partners in the existing structure. And I suppose back to the choices, isn't it? What do we focus our time on? We focused our time on delivering within the structures that are currently available.
Thank you very much. And on that, I'd like to invite James to provide the vote of thanks for me.
Oh, back again. Yeah, it's back again. Okay, so
I can hear you.
Bill, thank you. So I just wanted to kind of take the opportunity to reflect a bit on what we've heard today as part of the vote of thanks. It's been, what I would suggest is a small insight into your world, because I suspect there's a lot more to it, and like you say, many lectures we could get from it. But for me, it was really hearing about devolution in action. In fact, I'd rephrase that, successful devolution in action, where you've shared your own national transport strategy with us. And that included a very clear hierarchy that anybody in the room could understand, and certainly within the Team Scotland arena, where your starting point is walking and wheeling right down to the last thing that you want, which is that private car. And that really helps people focus in terms of what it is they're doing and where they spend the money. And then you have to try and describe it as a simple ABC, which then went off a bit on a tangent to other parts of the alphabet. So I'll just focus on the ABC. Alignment we've talked about, actually a very curious kind of area in terms of we all struggle with it sometimes, and so it's good to hear where that's been achieved, with partners as well as government. Building on success. I'll come back to actually. We've lost
Have you tried turning it off and on again?
I'm doing that now. Is there another one I can make? It has gone green again, but I'll use that one in a minute. Yeah, okay. So C is for competitive railway. So all about making things attractive for passengers and freight. And then, the one-liner, doing it efficiently. A very small, simple thing to say, but often very hard to do. I left building on success to last, because that was the bit that struck me the most, because that's the thing that is very rewarding, but often takes nerve. And what I was thinking about in terms of your Borders case was, it reminded me of a film where I think the philosophy was, if you build it, they will come, from a film called Field of Dreams. But what you shared with us today was, it happened, and things happened that contributed to that strategy. But I do wonder how many people at the beginning were wondering whether it would work after spending all that money. And so it's taken a few years for that to come to reality, but it must be very rewarding to see that at the end of that for those involved and those who were there on the day. So with that in mind, I'd like to just say thank you very much for sharing that part of your story with us. And would like to invite everybody else in the room to do so accordingly and say thank you very much.
So thank you, James, for that very eloquent vote of thanks. I would like to add to that with my own personal thanks, Bill, for an incredibly interesting lecture, and very humorous as always with yourself. But also add that to the thanks of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers for presenting the Sir Seymour Biscoe Tritton lecture. And I will always read that. I will never trust my memory. But also I'd like to extend the thanks to you on behalf of the Railway Division for what was an incredibly interesting. So for one last time, and I'm also inviting you online, because you now have the ability to do that with an icon, to please extend a vote of thanks in the normal way. For those of you that are in the room, unfortunately, this doesn't extend to online. There is a wine reception upstairs in the council room for those that have got time and inclination to join us. So please do. Bill will be up there to answer any further questions you may have, no doubt. Thank you, everybody.